Today we are going to talk about the anatomy of the respiratory system. These are the objectives or ILOs of this lecture. At the end of this lecture, you should know what are the main organs of the respiratory system and their functions. And also, you should be able to outline their macroscopic as well as microscopic anatomy and the function of each structure. When we are talking about the respiration, our respiratory system helps us in breathing or respiration. Actually, the process of respiration includes four parts. First one, the ventilation. That is the movement of air into and out of our lungs. The second one, gas exchange between the air in the lungs and the blood. So we call it external respiration. And then the transport of oxygen as well as carbon dioxide in blood to the tissues or towards the lungs. And the fourth one, gas exchange between the blood and the tissues, we call it internal respiration. In this lecture, we are going to talk about the process of ventilation only. That is the movement of air into and out of the lungs, which we call breathing. Let's see what are the functions of respiratory system. The major organs of the respiratory system function mainly to provide oxygen to body tissues for cellular respiration. And also it is involved in removing waste products which are produced by cells as carbon dioxide. And also it is important to maintain acid-base balance of body fluids by removing carbon dioxide. So those are the vital or the very essential functions of respiratory system for our survival. Other than that, some organs of respiratory system are also involved other non-vital functions, such as sensing odors by the nasal cavity and production of speech by the larynx, and also it gives aid or the help for straining during childbirth or coughing. What are the organs of the respiratory system? Actually, the respiratory system is a tract or a tube. It is mainly divided into two main parts by the point of larynx. The parts which are above to the larynx are called upper respiratory tract, which include nose, nasal cavity, sinuses, and pharynx. The organs lower to larynx are called lower respiratory tract. The lower respiratory tract again divide into two main parts called conducting portion and respiratory portion. The parts of the lower respiratory tract which are involved in active oxygen exchange are called respiratory portion. There they are involving exchange of air from lungs to blood. It includes respiratory bronchioles, alveolar ducts, and alveoli. The other parts of the lower respiratory tract, which are not actively involved in gas exchange, but which are involved in conducting gas or passing gas from lungs to outer atmosphere, we call conducting portion. It includes larynx, trachea, bronchi, and bronchioles. This image gives you an idea about the organs of the respiratory tract. You can see it start from the nose and the nasal cavity, then pharynx, then the larynx, which is the point where we divide our respiratory tract into two main parts, upper respiratory tract and the lower respiratory tract. And then it leads to the tube called trachea, then it divides into bronchioles, and then lungs are there, right and left lungs. Let's see one by one. The first structure is nose. The nose is divided into two main regions called the external nose and the internal nasal cavity. The external nose is a rigid structure composed of cartilages and bones. The internal nasal cavity is divided into two main parts by nasal septum, and it opens anteriorly and posteriorly by the openings called nares or nostrils. This is the external nose. You don't have to remember one by one. Just get an idea how it is formed, that you can see part of it is formed by bones and the other part is formed by cartilages. So this is the internal nasal cavity. So it is totally surrounded by the bones. So you can see there are some extensions from these bony walls. We call them concha. There are three set of concha: superior concha, middle concha, and inferior concha. This is mainly involved in increasing the surface area of nasal cavity. Now let's see the microscopic structure of this nasal cavity. The nose is lined with highly vascular, pseudostratified, ciliated columnar epithelium. Also, we call it ciliated mucous membrane. So, you may remember that this ciliated columnar epithelium may contain some mucus secreting cells. We call them goblet cells. So, these mucus are on the epithelial cells and they trap external substances which comes into the body with air, incoming air, and cilia which present on the surface of epithelial cells. They beat in waves to one direction in order to remove this mucus with those external substances towards the oropharynx in order to remove from the body. So the nose is lined with very vascular ciliated columnar epithelium which contain mucus secreting goblet cells. So all of these terms are very important when you are describing the microscopic anatomy and the related functions of internal nasal cavity. The most important terms are highly vascular, ciliated columnar epithelium, and mucus, also goblet cells. So you should address all these key terms when you are talking about the microscopic anatomy and also the related function of the nose. What are the functions of the nasal cavity or the nose? The first one is it serves as a passageway for air. The nasal cavity remains open even when the mouth is full of food. That means this nasal cavity always remains open to facilitate the air come into and out of body. It acts as a passage. And the second one is warming. First we have to know that always when things are coming from outer environment, these things are changed or adapted to the conditions that can be seen in our body. Temperature is an example. As you know that body temperature is higher than environmental temperature, the incoming air should adapted or it should come to the temperature of the body. So the nose, the nasal cavity do this function, so it is involving warming incoming air. It is done by immense vascularity of the mucosa. As I told you earlier, the nasal cavity is highly vascularized. So the temperature of this blood is adapt this air into higher temperature. So warming of incoming air is a very important function of nasal cavity. Then the other one is, it is important to filter and cleaning of air. Incoming air from outer environment contains many particles, dust, microbes. So in order to protect your body from these foreign substances, this nasal cavity filter them and clean this air. This is done mainly by two ways. One, as you know, there are tiny hairs in the interior ears. They trap larger particles and then filter air. This filtered air is going through the nasal cavity, and these smaller particles such as dust and microbes are adhered by mucus layer of the nasal cavity. The next main function of nasal cavity is humidification of incoming air. It is another adaptation of incoming air according to our environment of the body, that is adding moisture or the vapor to the incoming air. This occurs as air travels over the moist mucosa and becomes saturated with water vapor. So it is another important function of mucus of the nasal cavity. The next function is olfactory function, or it is the sense of smell. There are some nerve endings located in the roof of the nose, so they detect smell coming with the incoming air. The other one is the nasal cavity is important to determine voice sound. The nasal cavity and paranasal sinuses are acting as resonating chambers for speech. The sound that is produced by the larynx is converted into speech or words by different other organs like lips, cheeks, nasal cavity, and paranasal sinuses. The next organ of the upper respiratory tract is paranasal sinuses. They are air-filled cavities which lies within the bones of skulls. That means they are totally covered with bones. They are also served to warm and humidify the incoming air. And there is a special function of these paranasal sinuses, as they are air-filled cavities within the skull. They are important to lighten the weight of the skull. The paranasal sinuses, there are 4 pairs of paranasal sinuses in each skull. They are called frontal sinus, maxillary sinus, sphenoid sinus, and ethmoidal sinus. So these are the paranasal sinuses in your skull. There are 4 pairs: frontal sinus, ethmoidal sinus, sphenoidal sinus, and maxillary sinus. The next part of the upper respiratory tract is the pharynx. It is a tube formed by skeletal muscles, and it is lined by mucous membrane continuously with that of the nasal cavity. It is divided into 3 major regions called nasopharynx, oropharynx, and laryngopharynx. These are the 3 major parts of the pharynx: the nasopharynx, which lie just behind the nasal cavity, and the oropharynx, which lies just behind the oral cavity, and the laryngopharynx, which lie just above the larynx. The nasopharynx is the nasal part of the pharynx, which lies behind the nose above the level of the soft palate. On its lateral wall, there are 2 openings of the auditory tubes, or we call it Eustachian tube, which leads to middle ear. This connection is important in equalization of pressure of middle ear with the environmental pressure. When you have common cold, then this infection goes through this Eustachian tube to the middle ear, and it leads to ear infections. Nasopharynx is also involved in filtering bacteria and foreign particles from inspired or incoming air. The oropharynx is the oral part of the pharynx which lies behind the mouth. It is a common passage for both air and food. During swallowing your food, the nasal and the oral parts of the pharynx are separated by the soft palate and the appendage called vulva. The laryngeal part of the pharynx is the part which lies just above the larynx. It connects with the oropharynx above and it continues below as the esophagus. And it continues the route for ingested food as well as air until its inferior end where the digestive and respiratory system diverge. Let's see the microscopic anatomy of the pharynx. First, the mucous membrane lining or the epithelium. There is difference in nasopharynx and the other two parts of the pharynx. Nasopharynx is lined with ciliated columnar epithelium, while oropharynx and laryngopharynx are lined with stratified squamous epithelium. That is due to structure-function relationship. Nasopharynx only a passage for air. Therefore, it is lined with ciliated columnar epithelium which facilitate the cleaning, filtering, and warming of incoming air. But oropharynx and laryngopharynx are common for both food and air passage. As food is much more rough content, it is lined with stratified squamous epithelium as there is frequent wear and tear as you eat your food. That is the difference between the nasopharynx and the other two parts of the pharynx. And then the submucosa, that is the layer of tissue just below the epithelium. Submucosa is rich in mucosa-associated lymphoid tissues because both air and food come from outside of the body. So, mucosa-associated lymphoid tissues are important in immune system which protects your body against the incoming foreign agents. There is a muscle tissue or smooth muscle tissue which surrounds the pharynx. It helps to keep the pharynx permanently open so that breathing is not interfered. And there are some constrictor muscles which are responsible for constricting the pharynx during swallowing and pushing your food and fluid into the esophagus. Let's see what are the functions of the pharynx. It acts as the passage for both air and food. Air passes through the nasal and oral parts, while food goes through the oral and laryngeal parts. Other than that, the air is further warmed and moistened as it passes through the pharynx. And there are olfactory nerve endings in the pharynx which are important for the taste and the sense of smell. Another function of pharynx is aid in hearing. The auditory tube allows air to enter into the middle ear. Satisfactory hearing depends on the presence of air at atmospheric pressure on each side of tympanic membrane or eardrum. That is why you cannot hear properly when your eustachian tube is blocked. The pharynx is also involved in protection of our body. That is, the lymphatic tissue of the tonsils produces antibodies in response to the foreign antigens and protect our body against foreign substances which enter into our body. The pharynx also involved in speech. It acts as a resonating chamber for the sound ascending from the larynx and important for the speech. This is the end of the part 1 of the lecture on respiratory system. The other part contains the structure and function of the lower respiratory tract.